Afghanistan is a landlocked nation surrounded by 6 countries. Its longest border is shared with Pakistan, so the recent Taliban takeover in Kabul presents a new geopolitical challenge for Islamabad and the region at large. On August the 15th, Taliban fighters arrived at the gates of the Afghan capital after a rapid advance across the country. American troops were pulling out after 20 years, and the democratically elected President Ashraf Ghani had fled the country. The international community feared a possible power vacuum in Afghanistan and what it could bring. The Taliban marched into Kabul 20 years after being forced out. As the news was breaking, thousands of Afghans rushed to Kabul's airport, hoping to leave the country at any cost. Thousands headed to border crossings in the following days, while regional leaders worried about a possible flow of refugees. The UN estimates up to 500,000 Afghans could flee the country by the end of the year. That's on top of the 2.2 million who've already been forced into neighbouring countries because of decades of conflict. But for the region, this is not only a humanitarian crisis. In addition to the health risks brought about by COVID-19, there are also major security concerns. Pakistan hosts the highest number of Afghan refugees, nearly 1.5 million. So where does the Pakistani government stand on the Taliban's takeover? As world leaders gathered in New York for the 76th UN General Assembly, Afghanistan dominated the agenda. And that's where we caught up with the Pakistani Foreign Minister. Shah Mahmood Qureshi talks to Al Jazeera. Shah Mahmood Qureshi, Foreign Minister of Pakistan, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. Now, much of our time together now, we're going to be talking about Afghanistan, your closest neighbour, because the world has been watching the Taliban takeover. Let me start by asking you about this moment, because in some ways we see the conflict ending, the bombing and the fighting ending, but on the other hand, you have people, particularly in Kabul, very wary, very worried, very scared about the Taliban and many wanting to flee the country. So do you see this moment as a positive or a negative one?
Well, there is uncertainty, but I think the anxiety has gone down from where it was on the 15th of August for a number of reasons. One, there has been no bloodshed after the takeover. Two, the chances of a civil war, an immediate civil war, have been averted. Three, after the announcement of a general amnesty and commitment that there'll be no revenge, there is more calmness. So I don't think people are that restless at the moment. But yes, things remain uncertain. And if not addressed, some of the challenges not addressed immediately, then they can take a different turn.
I'd like to ask you more about the current situation in a moment, but let me just go back and examine what went wrong in Afghanistan. Let me start at the beginning. Do you think the US should have intervened in 2001?
Perhaps they had no choice then. The compulsion of public opinion after 9/11 was such, they perhaps had no choice.
Some say the US would have been better once it had intervened in 2001, then to have stepped out, put in a UN peacekeeping force with Islamic countries taking part, and certainly it would have been good if they hadn't diverted their attention to Iraq. Do you agree with that?
Those debates can go on, but they should have, in my view, focused on what they had gone in for. And the immediate focus that they had gone in was to decimate Al-Qaeda and punish people who were responsible for 9/11. Once they had done that, then they should have, in my view, worked towards a reconciliation and peace reconstruction effort instead of the destroyed infrastructure should have been rebuilt so that the country could have gone towards a normal life. If you look at the money that was spent, the bulk of the money that was spent was on security and less on development. And what you saw, when Taliban moved in, the government of Ashraf Ghani had lost credibility and support because people felt that life under them had not improved. They were not secure. There was squabbling, there was infighting, and they were not certain about their future.
But some claim there's another factor, and that's the fact that Taliban had a safe haven in your country. Let me just quote Amrullah Saleh, the former vice president of Afghanistan. We don't know where he is now. He fled to Panjshir and he's disappeared. But he says it's very clear the Taliban were never under pressure. They used Pakistan as their support base, not sanctuaries. The whole of Pakistan was at the service of the Taliban.
You could expect that from Amrullah Saleh, you know, because he speaks somebody else's language. You know, he is briefed from, you know, by one of our neighbors, and you know,
India, you're claiming?
Well, obviously, and you know, he's has been on their payroll for a while now. But what Pakistan did, Pakistan cleansed its areas. Pakistan undertook a number of operations to clean up, and we did it successfully at a cost. The safe havens, the fighters were across. You know, they were in Afghanistan. And we identified those safe havens that were being used against Pakistan. Our areas were cleansed. There was surveillance. There was monitoring going on. Whenever we were accused of safe havens, we said, we're willing to take you into the tribal region and come and see for yourself.
Foreign Minister, if I can turn to the current situation. The banking system in Afghanistan is barely functioning. Salaries are not being paid. On this programme a week ago, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said his biggest fear was a total economic collapse. Do you share that worry?
Yes, I do.
What would it mean for Afghanistan and the region, your country too?
Well, a collapse could lead to exodus. A huge influx of refugees moving in all directions towards Pakistan, towards Iran, towards Tajikistan. It could destabilize the entire region, and we are concerned about that. The collapse could give space to those people that we want defeated, the terrorists that we have, you know, worked so hard to sort of eradicate. The collapse will have serious consequences, not just for Pakistan, but for the entire region. And then the consequences can even spill out of the region.
You mentioned what you call terrorists. There were in Afghan jails not just Taliban. There were members of ISIL. There were members of the Pakistani Taliban. How worried are you about some of those people who got freed in those first days as the Taliban were taking control of the country?
Well, people who, the people who are in jails, like people who are linked to TTP, if they are free and sort of hopping around, it concerns me.
In terms of the economic situation, what about Afghanistan's assets? My understanding is there's about $10 billion, which currently is locked away, that the Taliban can't get to. Should that money be unlocked now, given the problems, the very dire economic problems that you've just talked about and the Secretary-General's been talking about?
Well, Afghanistan needs an economic injection, and that money could come in handy if available.
So what would your advice be to the international community and those that are holding that money?
Unfreeze.
Should some of it be unfreezed or all of it?
Well, I mean, I would say unfreeze it, make it available for Afghan people. You know, there's a humanitarian crisis in the making. Use that money to address that crisis.
But some countries, and I'm sure when you've been here at the UN General Assembly, you've been speaking to other foreign ministers from some Western countries, are wary about giving that amount of money, potentially, to the Taliban.
There can be ways and means devised to ensure that the money gets to the needy and is not misused.
How do you make a mechanism that does that?
Well, the UN can play a role.
Let me ask you about the Taliban and what they've done so far. They came in promising an inclusive government. They were talking to figures like the former president, Hamid Karzai, the former chief executive, Dr. Abdullah, and yet they came out with a cabinet that was all Taliban. What happened to those talks?
It seems that they are not unaware of including other ethnic groups, but to build a consensus, it takes time. It takes time. And the initial interim announcement was purely, Pashtun. But then the additions that they've made later on.
The junior ministers.
But that's inclusion, and that level can go up and there can be more inclusions. That shows that they have accepted mentally the idea of inclusivity by having Tajiks in, by having Uzbeks in, and having Hazaras in.
A very, very small number, and no women at all. We'll come back to the...
It's a beginning. It's a beginning.
We'll come back to the women, because that's a very important point. But in politics, no one ever wants to give anything up. And the Taliban right now seem to pretty much have absolute control. Why would they want to give that up?
For stability of their country, for reconciliation within Afghanistan.
What role did Pakistan have in the formation of the cabinet? Was it just a coincidence that in the hours beforehand, the head of your military intelligence, the ISI, General Faiz Hamid, was in Kabul meeting the Taliban, or did he help shape that initial cabinet?
They're very independent-minded people. They take their own decisions, and we as a policy have decided not to interfere in their internal matters. We will help when asked to help. And our objective, we will help to achieve our objectives. What are our objectives? Our objectives are peace and stability. So whatever we can do to achieve peace and stability, we will do. We have no business interfering in their internal affairs, but we share a border and we have concerns. There's trade that goes on through Pakistan. The growing footprint of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations is of concern, and if General Faiz was in Kabul to address those concerns, it was but natural.
So it was just a coincidence he happened to be there in the hours before the cabinet were formed, because many people thought he was there trying to negotiate. I don't know whether he was trying to negotiate for figures that Pakistan favoured, or whether he was trying to negotiate for a more inclusive government, but that's certainly the speculation. You say that's wrong.
Pakistan has been advocating for a more inclusive approach.
In terms of that Taliban cabinet, it's all Taliban. Some observers of the Taliban say it's not only all Taliban, it's hardline Taliban. The ones in the key positions are the ones that were fighting, rather than the ones that were negotiating in Doha. For example, Mullah Brada, who was the main negotiator, has ended up as the deputy prime minister, yet he was the most prominent figure in the negotiations. Do you see this as a hardline Taliban cabinet?
It's a compromise. In politics, you make compromises. You have to accommodate all points of view, and both sides have been taken in.
In terms of the Taliban now, as you know, there have been all sorts of reports, and we haven't been able to confirm them, so I'd like your view on it, of rows, division in the Taliban, even angry rows with a threat of violence. Let me quote you something that was said by the UN Secretary General recently at the beginning of the P5 meeting, the permanent members of the Security Council. He said, Afghanistan is unpredictable. We see a struggle for power within the Taliban leadership. What's Pakistan's assessment of that?
There's a struggle for power in every democracy. There's a struggle for power in every society, and Afghans are no different.
Of those cabinet members, there are 33 main members of the cabinet. Many are on the UN sanctions list. Mm-hmm. What should the UN, in your view, do about that? It includes the Prime Minister, 2 Deputy Prime Ministers, the Foreign Minister. Should those sanctions now be lifted at this stage so that you can engage better with the Taliban?
Well, in the talks that they were having with the US, which led to a peace agreement with the US and then commenced intra-Afghan negotiations, one hears that there was talk of delisting people who are on the sanctions list. Now, to what extent that commitments were made, Mullah Brother and Zalmay Khalilzad should know better.
The other thing that we've noticed about the cabinet is that there are no women in the cabinet. Right now, women are not really being allowed to go around about their normal business. They're not allowed to go to their jobs. We've seen that boys are going back to school, girls are not.
No, I disagree. My information is that girls are going to school, girls are going to college. They have not been restricted, but yes, they can be accommodated in the cabinet, and who knows, tomorrow they feel the need and have some inclusion. That might be a good idea.
Certainly I'm getting different information from you with speaking to people in Kabul who say that most women finding their lives very restricted. They're not allowed to go out without male companions, and that most girls' schools are not open.
What I've heard, they're not open because of different reasons. You can't pay salaries to teachers. The schools need teachers. So if you don't have teachers, how do you function schools? There are other, problems. It's not just a ideological reason. They have said so, that they will not prohibit girls from going to school, and I hope they live up to it.
Well, yeah, I'd like your view on that, because Pakistan is a country where women can go about their normal business. You had you had a woman prime minister, and I know you served for her.
Yes.
for a time. What do you think about restrictions that the Taliban are placing on women and women employment?
I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, that they asked people who were in service to come back and work. They
did initially. But,
yes.
My understanding is that many women are not being allowed to return to their actual jobs. They said that initial statement, but women are not being invited back to employment.
I have not heard of any restriction per se, but perhaps they, with the passage of time, they would sort of gain confidence, and you have to understand there is a trust deficit, and it takes time to bridge the trust deficit.
In terms of Pakistan, you have that very long border with Afghanistan. You're one of the neighbours, but you're the one that has had more refugees than any other. You've got 2,600 kilometres border. It's currently closed to most Afghans. Why is that?
The border's open. It's not closed. It's not closed.
Only if you have the right paperwork can you cross. Most people cannot.
The question is, would you allow people into your country without a passport, without documentation, without visas? Just tell me. You don't. There are certain norms that you have to follow.
There are certain norms all over the world, but as you know, that Afghan-Pakistan border has been a pretty porous border for decades, and there are families that live either side of it.
When the border was porous, we paid a price, and we were accused that people cross from this side, and create trouble over there, and we eventually fenced the border, and now we have fenced the border for better management and regulation.
One figure that you know well, I know, the former Pakistan ambassador to the US, Hussein Haqqani, warned even before the Taliban takeover that this would be a Pyrrhic victory for Pakistan. He said there would be a violent blowback with the Pakistani Taliban attacking targets inside Pakistan. How concerned are you about that coming to pass?
Well, I think the Taliban have made a clear commitment that they will not allow their soil to be used against anyone, and that includes Pakistan, for terrorist purposes. And I hope they live up to that promise.
We have, though, a huge amount of weaponry in Afghanistan. Some of the most sophisticated weaponry, which was either left behind by the Americans or was in the hands of the Afghan army, and it is now there in Afghanistan. I'll give you an example. It's never good making comparisons with different countries, but just look what happened in Libya after the fall of Gaddafi and the way that destabilised the Sahel region. Do you have worries about all that weaponry flooding the area?
If it gets into the wrong hands, yes, it'll concern me. Obviously, it'll concern me. It'll affect, the law and order situation in my country. Yes, that is why we are urging the international community to engage with the new reality so that things do not fall apart, so that there is semblance of order.
One worrying report is about the Taliban justice. Mullah Turabi, who was the former head of the religious police of the Taliban before, apparently now is in charge of the prisons. In a recent interview, he signalled they're going to go back to public executions and amputations for crimes. What do you make of that?
I am not aware of that. I'm not aware of that.
That is not the sort of Afghanistan you'd like as a neighbour, though, I'm guessing.
Not at all. Not at all.
In terms of the security situation inside Pakistan, you had that bloody campaign of terrorist attacks from 2007 to 2014. How is the security situation right now? And I'm asking in part because, as you know, it seems a bit flippant to bring up cricket now after all these heavy subjects we've talked about. But, both New Zealand and England have cancelled their plans to play in Pakistan because of the security situation and threats, but they haven't disclosed what those threats are.
I wish they did. When we learnt about it, we engaged with them. We assured them of security and protection, and to reduce their anxiety and to make them feel more protected. We also suggested that we will have these stadiums empty, right? But let the game go on. But they pulled back. It was disappointing.
What effect do you think what's happened in Afghanistan could have on the regional dynamics? Because yours is a difficult region and your relationship, particularly with India, is difficult. A very strained relationship, particularly concerning Kashmir.
Well, I hope India stops playing the role of a spoiler. India has been playing the role of a spoiler in Afghanistan, and they have not been helpful in the peace process. In fact, they were obstructionists in the process. And if they had not colluded with the Ghani government and blocked the negotiation process, there could have been a political settlement.
Pakistan is a democracy. You've had periods of military rule, but you seem to be on a pretty stable path of democracy right now. Afghanistan was a democracy from 2004. Yes, maybe a flawed democracy. No one is mentioning elections or voting for Afghans now. Has the international community given up on the idea of Afghans having democracy?
No, I don't think they have. Even when the talks were going on, there was an understanding that there will be an interim arrangement before they go into elections, right? So let things settle down, let things calm down, let people feel secure, then we can talk about representation.
Now, in terms of recognition of the Taliban, you're here at the UN General Assembly, leaders from around the world. This is the 1 week where they're all in one place. The Taliban have written a letter saying that they want to be the body that has the UN seat. What is Pakistan's view on that? Do you think that the Credentials Committee, which decides this, that they should give the seat to the Taliban?
I think the Credentials Committee could and should think by giving a seat to the representative who was appointed by the previous government that's fled and is no longer there.
He has no boss.
There is no boss, there is no acceptability. The rulers the authorities in Kabul do not recognize him. What role can he play? Who does he speak for? It's just a very practical way of looking at things. Who does he represent?
So that's the UN seat. Pakistan also has to decide as a country whether to recognise the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. Last time the Taliban were in power in the 1990s, you were one of just 3 governments that recognised the Taliban. What are your thoughts on that? Because that will be a decision for you and for your Prime Minister Imran Khan. Do you think it is time soon to recognise the Taliban?
We are watching, we are observing as things unfold, and we will take that decision at an appropriate time.
Shah Mahmood Qureshi, Foreign Minister of Pakistan, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.